When we want to pursue an understanding of free energy, the incorrect question to ask is, from where does it come? It's not going to elicit an answer very readily. The correct way to approach the mystery is to ask, why does it come at all? Not where, but why? Because the materials of construction of a circuit invite it. Why is this? Because when we take copper ore, let's say copper sulfate ore, and we smelt the copper ore to separate the sulfate from the copper, we're removing the energy of that compound, because the energy is attached to the negative ion, the sulfate ion. Depleting that mixture of energy, removing it from the mixture, and creating a copper metal whose atoms bind together, because it's like people who link their arms together at their elbows, through the crook of their elbows. They grab their belly with their two hands and stick their elbows out, and they create two loops on either side of each other, and so everybody links up through those loops, hooking their arms around each other's looped arms. And that's the way the copper is. It's so hungry for energy because it's had its energy removed due to the application of a tremendous amount of thermal energy. So we applied energy in the form of heat to remove the energy, the electrical energy of the chemical electrical energy of that compound of copper sulfate from the copper sulfate by removing the sulfate. And we end up with copper metal that binds together quite strongly because it's hungry. And so as hungry people do, impoverished poor people do, they band together to pool their limited resources to survive, and that's what the copper does. Now, being that it's hungry, it's vulnerable. And two things can happen. Either the conventional result or the free energy result. The conventional result is to apply peer pressure from an outside source. We call it a prime mover. Let's say it's a voltage source, to impose upon the copper to become dynamic despite its lack of energy. And because the chemistry of the battery remains outside the circuit, and the copper remains copper metal and we don't force the copper metal to become back into copper sulfate or anything similar. Consequently, the copper remains hungry no matter how much voltage we apply to that circuit. And all we do, we create a condition in which the copper passes the buck because it can't hold on to it. It was the sulfate ion that was capable of holding on to energy. The copper is incapable of holding on to energy. So it literally cannot sustain an energetic state and has to pass the buck, so to speak, to its neighbor to try to get rid of it. It's quite possible that the energy never enters the circuit anyway because the sulfate never returned. So we get this condition in which we're trying to force the copper atom to behave in a manner that it is incapable of doing. And so it can't sustain it. It can't store the energy at all. It would if it became copper sulfate again. Now, what we do in a free energy circuit is we don't try to fight the situation. We don't try to force the situation. We don't use peer pressure of tremendous voltage coming from the outside, predicated on some gimmick called the conservation of energy telling us how much voltage to apply. Instead, we apply environmental levels of voltage and arrange our copper coils and our glass capacitors and our resistors in such a way as to take advantage of the hunger of that copper to acquire energy from its environment one way or another so that it makes up the difference on its own through self-stimulation, owing to a small amount of stimulation coming from the outside. And the copper can fake it pretty well because it has room. You know, when the freeway is congested with traffic, nobody moves. And that's the state of copper sulfate. It's full of energy and really has no need to move because it already has energy. But when you've got a hungry state, a freeway that's fairly empty, there's plenty of room, and so the cars speed up even past the speed limit. if it's the middle of the night, especially bonsai drivers. 2 a.m., they're hauling ass down the freeway at 120 miles an hour and the police leave them alone. Well, that's the way the copper is. We can either force it from the outside using voltage, or we can force it from the outside using frequency, lacking voltage. One way or another, either frequency or voltage, we're using peer pressure of amplitude of voltage or frequency of voltage without too much amplitude. Either way, we're going to stimulate the copper to fake movement, even though we are not imparting any energy to the circuit, so conservation of energy is upheld. Zero energy enters and zero energy exits. Balance of energy. Input balances output. And that's essentially how circuits behave, whether it's conventional circuitry or free energy circuitry. We're dealing with a hungry state of copper. And chemically speaking, it is incapable of receiving energy and doing anything with it because there's no chemistry there. Instead, it behaves in a dynamic fashion because of its hunger, in a way that causes it to look like energy is moving around inside the copper wire, when in fact all it's doing is creating patterns of movement, in which, like a field of wheat, the wheat doesn't run around the field, it stays in one place, and it simply creates a ripple pattern when the wind blows across the surface, the top side of that field of wheat, making it look like something is moving. The only thing moving is a pattern. The patterns move. The wheat stays right where it is, stuck in the earth, and that's the way the copper behaves. It gives an illusion of movement without actually moving. Or a Mexican wave of people in a stadium rising up, raising their hands, and sitting down and lowering their hands, making it look like from the opposite side of the stadium that movement is happening, when in fact nobody's running around the stadium. They stay right where their seat is, but they move at right angles. So they do have a little room, a wiggle room for movement, but it has nothing to do with what it looks like. It's actually movement of a different sort. It's oscillatory movement that creates that ripple movement. So what we call DC is actually AC at right angles to what we think is DC, which is illusory. Nothing's moving even in DC, for that matter, let alone AC. It just wiggles. It either wiggles at right angles in the case of DC, or in parallel to the direction of movement in the case of AC. But it's still, all it does is wiggle from side to side. It never goes anywhere because it can't. But it has room to wiggle because we took away the sulfate ion, representing the fullness of energy that made it so satiated that it was lazy and didn't bother to move, and it couldn't move. And that was the dynamics of copper sulfate versus the dynamics of copper metal. So we have funny ways of looking at things because we use the wrong analogies. We use the analogy of water flowing down a pipe. That's not the correct analogy at all. That's so stupid, it's pathetic. But it's because it ignores the chemistry. We cannot ignore the chemistry because we're dealing with substance. If it was an abstraction, that would be different, but we're dealing with material substance, and so we have to pay attention to the chemistry that we have already induced when we smelted the copper ore to remove the sulfate or whatever ion was there associated with the copper, leaving the copper behind. We have to take that into account because that's the foundation of electrodynamics, is what we did to smelt the copper ore in the first place. That's where we have to begin to study what is free energy, what is conventional energy in electrodynamic behavior.